2. He looked up from the initial assault and peered about his surroundings. The shrill yells were getting closer, and he could now hear the battle cries of Cimmerians engaging the foe. Who it was that attacked them he was unsure. Lyr lifted himself off the ground and looked for Deirdre. She sat on her knees, gasping. In her upper arm, an arrow had sunk its hungry head. He lifted her to her feet and dragged her behind the wall of a house that was not yet aflame. She winced at the wound, but did not cry out. Lyr examined it quickly. The arrow had only grazed the muscle and not landed near the bone. He ripped the sleeve of her dress for a bandage. Then he removed the arrow and bound the wound, which was, thankfully, not bleeding very much, as it was shallow. "It will not kill you, but you will not be able to use your arm without aggravating it. You should not move it the rest of the night," he informed Deirdre. Then he tore part of his fine tunic, without concern for its ruination, and fashioned a makeshift sling for her. After tying it about her neck, Lyr slipped Deirdre's wrist through the loop. Men had spilled out of the longhouse, and were making a battle line. None had spared time to don their armor, and only a few had helmets. The shields they bore were narrow and long things, meant to be complemented by spears, but all that was available were swords and knives. Arrows whistled in the air again, and a man fell before the shields could be raised. "Who assaults us?" Deirdre asked. "What clan would dare?" Lyr feared it was no clan of Cimmerians intent on cattle raiding that now slew and wreaked havoc in the dun. He feared that in the shrilled voices that now screeched all around them, that the ancient foe of all Cimmerians, the painted Picts, had somehow snuck into the Dun's fields and lands. If so, the Picts would have already slain many along the way that could report their presence. Lyr drew the knife his mother had given him. It was his only defense. "A woman's weapon?" Deirdre asked. She laughed as she asked, "You are going into battle with a woman's weapon?" "Have you a better idea?" Lyr snarled. He did not realize that her remark had been issued out of hysteria rather than mockery. We hide, and one of the foemen comes by, we jump him and take his weapon," Deirdre replied. Lyr had to admit it was a better plan than remaining in the open ground without a shield to block the hail of arrows. He motioned to the main hall, and Deirdre shook her head. She instead pointed to the stables. Lyr nodded his agreement, and they ran. As they ran, another explosion of flame and sound erupted. This one cast light across the dark of the night, and in its momentary flames Lyr saw a wave of men surmounting the walls. The Cimmerians were outnumbered. Worse, now Lyr heard the snarling of animals. The foes had brought war dogs, or driven maddened predators before them. A rock from a sling impacted near where Lyr and Deirdre fled. "Picts," he uttered with resignation. "Crom, no!" Deirdre swore. They reached the stable, and found to their horror that they were not alone. The horses, that should have been screaming in fright from the flames and noise, lay still upon their sides. No blood stained the floor, nor was there any sign of violence. Various herbs that could have proven fatal sprung to Lyr's awareness. A man looked at them as they entered the door. Lyr knew him as Falcon. The man was a simpleton, having been born slow. He had proven useful in simple tasks, such as caring for the stable, and this had freed the warriors to train more. Lyr hoped that the time had been well spent. Falcon turned to them and howled. Deirdre asked him, "What's wrong with you? Are you hurt?" She tried to approach Falcon, but Lyr held her back. She looked at Lyr with confusion. Falcon approached them. He knelt and picked up a club from the floor. He growled something at them in a language that Deirdre did not know, but Lyr recognized the tongue. Part of his training had been the learning of languages. Kinnaid had taught him many of the words the enemies of the Cimmerians might use, and Lyr recognized them in the speech of the simpleton, though they were distorted. It was a Pictish speech, garbled by ancient and foul sorcery. Falcon approached them with jerking steps, as if he was wrestling with an unseen force. "He's bewitched," Lyr hissed. "How?" Deirdre asked. "I know not, but I put nothing past the sorceress Picts," Lyr said. He stepped in front of Deirdre. Falcon swung his club awkwardly. Lyr ducked it, and using the pommel of his knife he struck at the man's arm. He scored a hit along the radial bone of Falcon's weapon arm, and the man dropped the club with an angry growl. Lyr tried to hit Falcon in the head with the pommel to subdue him, but the simpleton's hands cinched around the boy's throat. Falcon's frame was large and well-muscled from decades of labor. In Lyr's sight the world began fading while he struck at the man's arms and head with the blunt end of his dagger. From behind Falcon, Deirdre beat the simpleton with the falling club, but the man would not fall. As he was about to black out, Lyr concluded he had no other choice. If he allowed Falcon to slay him, Deirdre would not be able to defend herself with only one arm to use. Lyr flipped the knife in his hand and sank it into the hollow of the man's collarbone. The knife blade bit down and true into the artery that ran below Falcon's clavicle. Lyr withdrew the blade and blood streamed upward. Falcon fell, dead, his hands still about Lyr's throat. The last thing that Lyr saw before he passed into unconsciousness was Deirdre struggling with the fingers of the dead man. He awoke to the sounds of more screams and clashing steel. Deirdre's face was above him. He was laying on the floor of the stable, and she was kneeling over him. "Thank Crom you live!" she exclaimed. "Where are they?" Lyr asked hoarsely. Deirdre pointed outside a small window in the stable wall. Lyr looked and saw that the Cimmerians had managed to keep a battle line. They were confronted by a screaming, rolling mass of Picts. The Picts alternated from attacking the shield wall up close with spears and hand weapons to then retreating a few steps, creating space. In this gap, stones, javelins, atlatl darts, and arrows flew. The Picts, through force of numbers, were wearing down the center of the Cimmerian line. Yet the cost to them seemed heavy, and Lyr could not understand why the Picts would not flee. Then he heard a blast of horns, and the Picts gave way again. However, rather than release missiles at the Cimmerians, the Pictish host parted. Through the gap the Picts had made in their ranks, there charged packs of wild and snarling wolves. Bears followed behind the wolves, and though their damage to the Cimmerians was minimal, the animalistic fury achieved another goal. It required many men to fell a bear. As the Cimmerians concentrated their efforts on the predators, small gaps appeared in the shield wall. Through those gaps arrows sped, and Cimmerians died. Lyr could foresee how the battle would end. He also knew that he and Deirdre had little chance of evading discovery, yet it was the only plan to which he could consider any action. He began looking for some place in the stable to effectively hide, but he found none, and he deduced that the Picts would simply burn the stables and the homes of the dun. Lyr looked to Deirdre. "We must flee," he said. "I am not abandoning my kin," Deirdre hissed. "Do you honestly think the two of us can save them?" Lyr asked. "I can at least die with honor," Deirdre replied. "Die with honor? How will that help anyone? We can evade the Picts now, gather together survivors as we go, and find a way to either a nearby village or mount a rescue of the survivors. Either way, we are going to need more than a brave but wounded woman and a weakling to rescue them. We need warriors," Lyr said. Deirdre looked out into the field. She conceded. "Some of the totem banners are missing. Some of the lords must have escaped." "Which?" Lyr asked. "The snake is not present, nor the boar," Deirdre replied. "That's the way we travel, then. Let's go," Lyr commanded. They were about to make their flight when something unexpected happened in the battle outside. As often happens in war, a victory is not gained by careful planning or superior training in arms, but by chance. Amongst the line of fighting men, Rion stood. His sword flicked out occasionally at the assaulting Picts and animals. In the midst of the fighting, he spotted the chieftain that led the Picts' attack. Rion picked up a spent javelin and, enraged, threw it at the man, without expecting to strike him. Yet at the moment it neared its mark, the Picts that surrounded the war leader parted, and the javelin struck the man in the heart. The javelin's flint tip proved as lethal as the bronze arrowheads the Cimmerians used. The war chief fell backward, and a strange undulation arose amongst the Picts. The Picts ceased their attack, and the wild animals retreated from the fray. The Picts remained there for a moment, staring silently at the Cimmerians. Rion could not have known that amongst this tribe of Picts that a war died with its war leader. Their war chief slain, the Picts had no reason to remain. They withdrew from the field warily. Lyr could now hear the lamentations of men and women the Picts had already taken prisoner coming from beyond the wall. Curses of the short, painted men drifted on the wind. There were no pleas for mercy, but Lyr suspected that it would only be a matter of time. Picts were not known for their gentleness. Of the Cimmerian warriors, barely 30 remained, and these were split into groups of 4 or 5 that each had loyalty to a different chieftain. Parnade and his brother Kinnaid lay dead upon the field, having been mauled to death by bears. Taunt stood panting, wounded from a gash in his scalp, but alive. The Darewood was nowhere to be seen, and the Brehon that had addressed Lyr earlier stood with his robe ripped open and a scratch on his aged chest. Even he had been blooded against the foe. Lyr and Deirdre revealed themselves and ran to the knot of warriors. She was embraced by Rion and kissed him heartily. The young man, high with the elation of having survived a battle, did not wince from the way her kiss aggravated his nose. Rion was being praised by the men about him, and he exulted in it. The Brehon, grim and unsure of the developments, found himself bound by Cimmerian traditions more potently strict than any civilized law. He took from Parnade's corpse the circlet of his office and handed it to Rion. Men of the Stag, will you have this man as your chieftain? The Brehon asked. The men, high on battle lust, shouted they would. Thus Rion was made a chieftain by the voices of only 30 men. The Brehon placed the circlet on the boy's brow and stepped back. The Brehon motioned for Lyr to approach him. Wait, Rion commanded. They all became silent. Where were you in the fight? He asked Lyr. I was protecting Deirdre. She was wounded, Lyr answered honestly. Then you spilled no blood, coward that you are. You found a place to hide, like a rabbit in its burrow, Rion mocked. I have not been trained for war, Lyr said. Yet I have slain a man tonight. Mayhap more, if the need arises. The threat was not lost on any that stood there. Through his broken nose, Rion spat, You're not a bard yet. Lyr bent, picked up a sword from a fallen man as well as his shield. He took a resolved stance and addressed Rion. Come then. Send another Cimmerian to Crom, when you should be sending more Picts to the pit of Aralu and rescuing our kinsmen. Can you not hear, even now, how the Picts abuse their captives? But come, slay me rather than do heroic deeds worthy of a man. I'm sure Taunt, who is a bard, will spread your infamy. The remark cooled Rion's anger. Though he was a brute, he was not one without some basic cunning. He realized that Lyr's words were indeed true. He was a chieftain now, and there were expectations he must meet. It was now to him to order men into battle, any man not a bard, a Darewood, or a Brehon. He smiled evilly and said, You are correct. I let our rivalry overwhelm me. Forgive me. As you can see, my blood is up. But you speak as a true son of Cimmeria now, Lyr, son of Iphi. So as a true son of the clan, I command you, and all that can hear me, to gather up the wounded and any survivors, bring them hence, and we shall begin a rescue effort, a war party which could benefit from your wisdom. Rion extended Lyr a wrist clasp. Custom dictated that Lyr accept the obvious deception at face value. Lyr had no choice but to take the man's wrist. Part of him longed for the acceptance that Rion offered publicly. Inwardly, Lyr knew it for some further trick. Yet what else could be done? The course that Rion had laid out was the correct one. I will begin tending the wounded, Lyr said. Good man, Rion agreed. Then he turned to the other men to begin commanding them. Deirdre looked upon Lyr with admiration. Her expression of hope gave him a longing to believe that Rion had indeed some core of worth that Lyr had not seen. The next hours were filled with the binding and cleaning of wounds. It turned out that the Picts had not slain as many as Lyr had feared. They had concentrated on killing the fighting men and cowering women into submission. From the survivors, Lyr deduced that perhaps only 100 men had perished, but many more were wounded. Rion could easily mount a sizable force of slightly wounded men to follow the Picts. From the composition of the survivors, Lyr also realized that the Picts had taken many of the young women away, and a large portion of the children. It's like culling a herd for the choice bulls and heifers, Lyr observed. He wondered to what purpose the captives would be put. Images of sacrificial fires and slavery were all that appeared to his imagination. Weary in mind and body, Lyr found himself sitting once again at the table that he had been given his honors at. The night was now starting to retreat, and day was dawning. He sipped at the ale, and wondered if he could risk some sleep. Yet as he felt slumber approach, Rion entered. The new chieftain had wasted no time in appropriating the best armor, weapons, and jewelry for himself. Now the wealth of the clan lay in a great pile, and Rion divvied out arms and armor to men, and even some women, who had slain Picts, and made them new members of high status in the clan. His duties done, Rion retreated from the public view and sat in Parnade's old throne. Lyr did not appreciate the way that Rion fondled the chair's arms, yet it would not be his problem to care about soon. The Brehon entered, and with him were two of the warriors that had escorted him to the dun. Taunt and his servant followed. Lyr realized that he had never been introduced to the Brehon, and he did not know the man's name. Chieftain Rion, of the people of the Stag, what decisions have you made about the pursuit of the Picts? The Brehon asked. We will give our warriors 4 more hours of rest, then I will lead a sortie. Each man will carry extra weapons and rations. The Picts succeeded because they attacked in the dead of night and with the element of surprise. If we can free our captive kin, they will fight with us. A maddened Cimmerian is worth 3 Picts in any fight, said Rion. It is a good plan, Lyr said out of turn. Everyone turned to him, surprised. You agree with the chieftain? Taunt asked. He is correct about the nature of Cimmerians. Give us a blade and we'll fight. We'll kill, Lyr replied. Then he drank his remaining ale in a great gulp. The look on Falgun's dying face was haunting him. Lyr continued. If we hurry, we can catch them before they get too far away. They are Picts, wood-born and wise, Taunt argued. They must have some heavy engine with them. How else could they have thrown that fiery mixture over the wall? They'll be loath to leave behind such a war trophy, and the Cimmerians they hold in bondage now will slow them. Chieftain Rion is correct. Now is the time to pursue them, said Lyr. Then he lifted his flagon to Rion as a salute to the man's insight. Rion looked smugly surprised. He had clearly expected an argument. Make all ready as I commanded. Any that wishes to go with us is welcome, Rion ordered. Who will you leave here to guard the dun? The Brehon asked. Somlunth, Rion answered. Somlunth can hold the dun while I am away. The men approved of the choice. Somlunth was an older warrior who had once been a great hunter. He would be a calming force, and also because of his age, he would be unlikely to attempt to wrest the dun from Rion. Rion now turned to address Lyr. You should rest as well. We will need you. Why? Lyr asked. You can heal, and there are likely to be grievous injuries amongst the wounded and captured. Your clan needs you, Lyr, Rion said. Lyr silently glowered at him. I realize, now, that we have been cruel unjustly to you. Please, man, don't hold the sins of my youth against our kin, Rion pleaded. Lyr hated that there was no way to spit at Rion now. He was not yet a recognized member of the Sacerdotal orders. He had to comply. Aye, chieftain, Lyr replied. He rose from the table and left the longhouse. Near the longhouse there was a primitive barracks that the landless warriors slept and reveled in. Into this building Lyr now walked, and he found an empty bed to lay his head. Slumber brought Lyr no peace. It was full of images of the battle of the day before. Lyr relived having to slay Falgun. The look in the man's eyes had not been his own. The maddened gaze was clearly the result of sorcery. Lyr had heard that there were sorcerers who could control the minds of the weak. Falgun, being slower in wits, had been an easy victim for the sorcerer. A sorcerer that still lurked amongst the ranks of the Picts. In his dream Lyr sensed the man in the distance. The sorcerer's will was like a searchlight. The magician peered through the dreaming world and sought out any mind that might be seeking his own. The light crossed Lyr's dreaming mind in passing, remaining long enough to assure itself that the boy was not a threat. The intense will conjured itself with blinding light and crushing force that squeezed the breath from the sleeping boy. Yet Lyr managed to escape its assault. He thought of Deirdre, and of things he wished he had said or done between them. Convinced it had encountered merely another teen boy with the dreams of youth, the searching sorcerer's will moved onward. But something in Lyr's character demanded he follow the eldritch light. Across the wooded hills of Cimmeria, Lyr's mind followed the light. The waking world appeared as a shadowy and blurred representation of its normal state. It was as if a thick, stained glass window pane was before his sight. The world of trees and plants glowed with a soft white, green, and blue light. Pigs moved in the shadows, clothed in various shades of red and orange. Cimmerians tied to ropes marched in front of jabbing stone spears. Lyr's kinsmen appeared wrapped in various shades of blue and brown. Animals stalked alongside the Picts, and Lyr understood that the bears and wolves he witnessed were acting under the malign influence of sorcery. The animals appeared as compositions of yellow and orange light, but around their heads there was woven a black and purple glowing sphere. Lyr followed the train and understood that he was not witnessing something that was happening in the past or present, but the future. The sun was not visible. Above the marching prisoners, the stars could be seen. From the position of the constellations, Lyr saw that the scene below him was 5 days in the future. The marching line passed below a peak that he had not seen, but he knew from descriptions his uncle had given while visiting his mother's home. He felt the sorcerer's will returning, and before he was detected, he forced himself to awaken. Lyr awoke in a sweat. He felt his forehead and could detect that he was feverish. He stumbled to a gourd filled with water and drank deeply. Then he marched out to find the chieftain. Lyr discovered not Rion sitting in the longhouse, but the nameless Brehon and Taunt discussing the events of the day before. "Forgive the interruption. I believe I know where the Picts will be," Lyr said. "Oh?" the Brehon asked. "I believe they are traveling by night. I know not why they restrict themselves so, but I believe it to be true. They march towards the ruins of Caradar," Lyr said. "What makes you believe this?" the Brehon asked. Lyr debated only a second if he should be fully honest with the man. He decided that the safety of the prisoners was more important than however he might be viewed. "The Pictish sorcerer is using his charms to observe the march of his men. I saw his intent in a dream," Lyr replied. Neither the Brehon nor the bard gave Lyr any sense that they doubted him. Finally the Brehon spoke. "Darewoods are sometimes so blessed to see an omen, but usually only after many years of training, and not often. During the battle I had to kill a man who was bewitched. I believe the spell may have passed from him to me, like a contagion," Lyr said. The Brehon nodded. The Cimmerians often told legends where such a passing of a curse was the core of the story. "Very well. But do not tell Chieftain Rion that you might be experiencing visions. Men often strike at that which they cannot understand." "Rion's never needed an excuse to swipe at me," Lyr muttered softly. The Brehon approached him and asked, "Was it the first time you killed a man?" Lyr nodded. "The warriors boast about the men they have slain, for they are afraid to admit that the faces haunt their dreams. There is always a doubt that whispers in the ear. I could have done more. I should have found some other way." "Do you believe that there was another way?" the Brehon asked. "No," Lyr answered. "Then forgive yourself, young man. Before this business is done, you will be called upon to kill many Picts. You cannot afford to pause when faced with a painted man. He will have no second guessing about gutting you," the Brehon said. Lyr nodded, then asked, "Sir, might I have your name?" The Brehon smiled. "You are correct. We were not introduced. I am Epinart," the Brehon said. "It is good to meet you," said Lyr. "Thank you. I regret I have grievous news for you," Epinart began. "Have you heard the names of the slain?" "No, I was busy binding wounds," Lyr said. Then he asked Epinart, "Why?" "Your mother is amongst the dead," Epinart replied. Lyr nodded. He walked away from the conversation and sat in a chair on the far side of the hall. He faced away from the other men and towards the darkness. He loathed that, mixed with the grief at the news of his mother's death, there was a sense of relief. He both hated himself for this and took comfort in it. The scars he hid from sight, the ones that crisscrossed his back, itched at the news. He was confused in that he hoped that she had suffered, and also that she had not. It was the kind of vile mixture of honest and incomprehensible emotions that drove men to drink themselves into stupors. But he could not allow himself the release of intoxication. There was work he would be called upon to do soon. An hour later, Rion and Deirdre emerged from the chieftain's room. It was not difficult for Lyr to determine how they had decided to celebrate Rion's ascension to the throne. The contented look in Deirdre's features all but broadcasted aloud that she was no longer a maid nor a virgin. Jealousy, dark and bitter, squirmed in Lyr's belly, but he chained it up and placed it deep inside a secret vessel inside his mind. What other outcome could he have expected? He was soon to be removed from the society of men, and Rion was a chieftain with wealth, honor in battle earned, and men to command. What woman would not wish to entrap such a fish early in the morning? Epinard approached the newly coronated chieftain and bowed his head. Chieftain Rion, auguries have shown us that the Picts are defended by a sorcerer. Even now the hated wretch peers at us with his black arts. Your men should be blessed and carry talismans for the hunt, that foul magic should not harm them. Very well. Is the Derwid able? Rion asked. I think there may be life enough in him for the task, Taunt replied. Go and make him ready, Rion commanded the bard. Then he looked to where Lyr sat. Lyr, go with the bard. Neither he nor the Brehon will accompany us on the hunt. If the Derwid has any advice on how to pursue these Picts and avoid sorcery, bring it back to me. As you order, said Lyr. He rose quickly, not trusting himself to be in close proximity to Deirdre. His anger at her decisions might tempt him to give offense. He could not afford that. As they walked across the carnage of the battlefield, Lyr saw Cimmerian children and the elderly clearing away the bodies of the dead. There were so many corpses that there was no time to fight the stony ground and dig graves. Instead, a great pyre was being crafted. Lyr turned his gaze away from the scene and tried to calm his mind. The Derwid had been taken to a house that had once belonged to one of the wise women. Skilled with herbs and needle, these women tended to most of the Dun's wounds and ailments. Lyr knew the house and its owner. He had also seen her amongst the dead, a broken stone axe blade in her skull. He shook. He wondered how it was that warriors could become so used to the evidence of death. Lyr hoped he would never have to become so inured. The Derwid lay on his side. A pair of picked arrows had skimmed the left side of his chest. The wounds were not deadly in and of themselves, but Lyr could see the evidence of poison. The arrows lay on a table next to the fallen man. Lyr lifted one and sniffed. Snowflake adder venom, he said. It was a death sentence. The snowflake adder was highly venomous. Its venom produced hallucinations and could paralyze parts of the body. The Derwid had perhaps a matter of hours to live. Hairn, Taunt called softly as he knelt. Hairn, can you hear me? It looks for us with an iron grip, the Derwid muttered. Hairn, I must call upon you to bless the men, Taunt whispered. But the Derwid could not hear him. The man rolled onto his wounded side and yelped. He looked at Taunt with eyes that did not see the waking world. Black and purple shades. That's all I see. Black and purple lights for all eternity, the Derwid babbled. He won't be able to assure the men they are protected if we can't keep him lucid, Taunt lamented. We may not need to, Lyr said. He could envision the Cimmerians, normally fearless, reluctant to charge the foe if they feared sorcerous arts. Magic was something that caused them all to fear. After slaying Falcon, Lyr knew that fear well. They needed to negate the Pict's eldritch advantage if they were going to save their kin. What do you mean? Taunt asked. Lyr sat on the bed next to Hairn. He took the man's hands. Make me a Derwid. Tell me what I must do. You don't see, Hairn complained. I have seen our kin in blue and brown. I have seen the world in its greens and white shades. I know the dream of which you speak. Invest me. Tell me what I must do, Lyr commanded. The man became lucid for a moment. He grasped Lyr's wrists and said, Crom knows his own. Crom knows his own, Lyr repeated. Hairn's lucidity remained long enough for him to smile in approval. Then he began clattering his teeth and pulling at his hair. Lyr pried his wrists away from the madman and began looking through the Derwid's things. Amongst his possessions, Lyr saw several wood tablets into which the priest had etched important rituals. He read these quickly and discovered that the Derwids used herbs and incense and talismans engraved with a sign to ward off evil. This recipe they had inherited from the dim mists of time. The art of past ages was so potent that it could still guarantee its success. Yet he also read that the talismans only worked upon the bearer, not because of any overt magic, but because it bolstered the will of the recipients. There was no promise it would work against the foulest sorceries, only the fear of such. Lyr laughed bleakly. The protective charms of the Darewoods were but confidence tricks. Taunt tentatively touched the boy's shoulder. "Are you all right?" "I am fine," Lyr said when he recovered. He asked, "Is there some symbol of vestment I should wear?" Taunt lifted a medallion that had been laid upon the table. It was made of clay, and depressed into the clay was a triangle. Inside the triangle there was a square, and inside of this a cross. Lyr recognized the symbol's intent from the legends he had been taught to recite. The triangle represented Ben Morg, Crom's mountain. The square was his anvil. The cross was a stylistic hammer and tongs. He placed the clay medallion around his neck and gathered up the wooden tablets. Lyr and Taunt walked back to the longhouse. When they entered, they found Rion donning armor with the help of his new wife. To Lyr's surprise, Deirdre also wore a leather cuirass. Her hair was bound back in a long ponytail secured with leather thongs. She clearly intended to follow along with the rescue party. Lyr imagined what he would have to do to keep control of himself while the newly wedded couple would be enjoying a great adventure. "Crom laughs," Lyr muttered. "That he does. Of all the worthy men who died last night, that one is the one that survives and becomes chieftain," Taunt whispered. "Crom laughs indeed." Lyr decided that he should have become a bard. His tongue was likely to get him in trouble, and bards were allowed the grace to speak their will without reprisal. Well, the dice had been cast. "Chieftain Rion," Lyr began, "Hairn, the Darewood, cannot perform his duties. He has appointed me to succeed him." A look of momentary distress crossed Rion's face. "Did he instruct you on how to protect my warriors?" "Yes," Lyr said. "Good. Proceed," Rion ordered. Lyr left the chieftain and his new bride. The two young adults continued preparing their armor and weapons for the expedition. Lyr resented himself that he envied them. Upon the blood-stained ground of the battle, 30 Cimmerian warriors had assembled. None had any debilitating wounds, but some had bandages around the light wounds that the Picts had scored on them. Now eager faces peered at Lyr. Their eagerness to be on the trail and pursuing the kill overpowered their habit of ridicule. None mocked Lyr at the moment. He was unsure how much authority the medallion of a Darewood allowed him, but for now he was no longer Lyr the Bastard. He finished pounding the mixture and the wooden mortar he was holding, and then dumped the contents into a burning bowl. This he ignited, and walking in front of the lines, he exposed the warriors to the incense smoke. Around each neck he then placed a bone charm engraved with a squiggly sign. Lyr gave the warriors a speech about the efficacy of the charms, and added that the blessing only worked if the men themselves were brave. This shifting of the burden of proof to the bearer, rather than the item, assured that the men would drive themselves harder against the foe lest they be thought cowardly or deficient. Lyr was disgusted with himself for such a deception, but they were about to engage a much larger force of Picts, and they needed every tool for the task they could muster. If he had to speak a lie to encourage his kinsmen to be brave, so be it. Rion now appeared from amongst the ranks and addressed his warriors briefly. Reading the subtle cues from their posture and guarded expressions, Lyr noticed that the older warriors were polite in their attention, but that they inwardly held reservations about their young chieftain. Chieftain Rion would have a hard road ahead to prove himself worthy to these battle-hardened men. "I'm going to have to help you rule, you bullying ass," Lyr whispered to himself. He feared a future of having to remain in the dun and daily watch Rion enjoy fame, wealth, and marriage. Lyr hoped his disgust did not show on his face. Amongst the warriors, a few women had also taken up the mission. Lyr knew these for being women that had lost children or husbands in the battle. Cimmerian women sometimes aided in the hunting and the warfare of the tribe. In such instances they normally were regulated to the use of missiles and darts to harass the foe. 4 women, clustered around Deirdre, had applied themselves to the mission. They would not slow the warriors, for all Cimmerians were used to running and climbing. All but one. A shiver of doubt went through Lyr. Like most of his kin, he had been almost exclusively raised upon a farm. He had little knowledge of the wilderness or how to survive in it. He could make a fire and identify plants with expertise, but hunting and moving at speed was not something to which he was used. He resolved he would, no matter what, keep the pace. Willpower would have to carry the task where his body was lacking. With a motion of his arm, Rion and his warriors took off at a run across the dun. They had no horses to aid them, as the possessed Falcon had slain them all. Rion had told his warriors that they would be moving at a double march, with little time to rest. The goal was to cut off the Picts before they reached Caer Dar and attained the thicker and wilder forests of their homeland. If the captives reached the Pictish wilderness, they were lost. Each warrior carried a backpack full of gear. Extra weapons, arrows, spears, and provisions were all taken. Camp gear that would normally be brought, such as bedrolls and tents, was left behind. A few pots for cooking and supplies for making salves were the utility items that they carried. For Lyr's part, his kit included the wooden tablets he had taken from Herne. Each of these was wrapped in a leather cover to prevent chipping and wear. Lyr would read them each night until he had memorized their contents. For his weaponry, he had been given a light mace and a shield. It had been decided that this was best, since he had little skill with a spear or bow. A mace is a quick weapon to learn, being little more than a weighted club, and against armored or unarmored foe, it is equally effective. The rescue party passed by burned homes and raided farmland as they left the walls of the dun. They passed the place where deep wheel ruts revealed the position where the Picts had placed their engine. The engine was not as big as Lyr had thought it would be. He wondered how a primitive people, like the Picts, had found and been able to operate such a device. From the impressions of the wheels, Lyr could see that the engine was small enough to fit on a light cart. Animal tracks revealed that it had been pulled there by oxen. This was good for the Cimmerians, since the oxen and the cart would limit the ground through which the engine could be transported. Yet how the Picts had managed to transport the engine all the way from their homeland, or wherever they had found it, across the hilly and forested soil of Cimmeria? There was little time to wonder about it, for as they left the land of his tribe, they passed by the ruined and smoking home of Lyr's mother. The house had been reduced to ashes. The stones that had made its wall had been broken down, and only one wall remained standing. The roof was completely burned away, and all the animals slain or driven off. Lyr looked at the rows he had planted, and saw that they were now littered with debris and the dead. His back itched at the memory of all the times he had been whipped for not working that field well enough to please his mother. He looked away. Misreading his emotion, a warrior beside Lyr said, "We'll revenge her." Revenge was not what she sought for comfort, Lyr thought, but he held his tongue. The forests of Cimmeria refused to aid the invaders. The ground readily gave away proof of their passing, seeming to recoil in indignation from the invasion of the painted men. By the time they needed to make camp, the Cimmerians could tell that the Picts were perhaps not even a full day ahead of them. Running past the Picts in the daylight and setting up an ambush at Caer Dar now appeared highly probable. The Cimmerians were possessed of grim, but high spirits. Realizing that they may not have many chances to be at ease later, many Cimmerians retired early. Many, but not all. Lyr read the wooden tablets by the light of the campfire. Though there were no tents to grant privacy, a hung cloak or two were strung to create barriers to sight. From behind these, Lyr could hear the grunting of Rion and Deirdre as they coupled. They were not alone. From behind another partition, some of the other women were spending the night with brave warriors. A few men spoke quietly in small knots, and none paid attention to Lyr. In typical Cimmerian fashion, they simply did not respect a Darewood when there was no ceremony to be performed. After reading the tablet, Lyr could see why they would feel so. Most of the ceremonies that the Darewoods preserved were simply social rites of passage. Indeed, the only miraculous power they seemed to possess was the incense smoke that warded off the attention and presence of evil spirits. Much of the rest that he read seemed a record of superstition and advice on how to manipulate an audience. The only passage that seemed to be scriptural advice read, "Crom speaks to each of us alone, and none of us together. Thus, whatever a man feels he is called to do, or is right, he must argue with his peers, so that he may not fall into error." The tablets contained other couplets, quatrains, and triads that detailed ceremonies and behavior of the Darewood. Lyr lamented that there were no deep secrets therein contained. There was no revelation about why the gods seemed often uncaring, or worse, why men were more so. There was, however, no bribe for good behavior proffered either. Instead, a series of practical admonitions for living was engraved in the wooden face of the tablet. Lyr pondered the individual oium, wondering if perhaps there was some code in placement or structure of the letters. But all that occurred to him was that he found his mind turning over the admonitions in various ways and interpretations. He supposed that was a kind of magic of its own, but he had preferred a curse to strike his enemies dead. Then he chuckled. It's called a bow and dart, you lazy, ungrateful wretch, he said to himself. Then he set the tablets aside and watched the fire. When they had stopped for camp, he had circled the encampment with a burning bowl and spread the special smoke. He knew that they were hidden from the sorcerer's eyes. In his mind he began to imagine what kind of man could control the beasts and peer across the unseen distance. He imagined a tall giant of a man, possessed of a burly build and handsome features. How else could he command men? Rion had imposed his will upon the Cimmerians not only from the credit he had received from that lucky stroke in battle, but because he was pleasing to look at. He appeared to be an idol of a chieftain. Chieftain Crooked Nose, Lyr whispered, smugly satisfied with himself. Whatever the Pictish sorcerer had done, or however he appeared, Lyr was sure he would meet the man soon. He sipped at his water-skin and watched the flames. From beyond the circle of his fire, the grunts and moans were increasing in volume and intensity. Rion's warriors made jokes about his prowess with approval. Feeling sickened by the erotic display, Lyr left his fire and walked into the woods to watch the stars. Secluded, he repeated the constellations and the names of the stars to himself. He sat by the trunk of the tree and let sleep overtake him. He awoke from dreams of something looking for him, but frustrated in its attempts. Lyr blinked and realized he was stiff. He had fallen asleep against the trunk in an upright position. Worse, the ache of the double march from the day before had now set into his thighs and calves. He almost groaned in pain as he stood. A full day of making his muscles perform again awaited him. He searched his memory for some herb or unguent to aid him, and found none. Some things are unable to be aided by skill or art, and require endurance. Worse, when he returned to the camp, it was obvious that none of the warriors nor the women felt the strain. Lyr was once again the weakling. He trailed at the rear of the column and labored to keep the pace. He had no way of knowing that he was doing well, considering that he had never been on a long march, nor that the warriors did not begrudge him. Lyr could not accept that what he viewed as weakness and sloth was in fact an impressive display of determination. He only knew that he would be responsible for them not making the time they could without him. He feared they would not be in place in time to save their kin, and it would be his fault. The entirety of that day the demeanor of the hunters had changed. They were no longer on a grand adventure of great song-worthy deeds. They were solely aware of their task. They moved through the hilly forest with ease and skill, not unlike that of their prey. In their native woodlands, they held the advantage, for they were used to the terrain and knew what to expect of it mile by mile. The Picts would be following a roughly cut trail they had used to infiltrate, and it would slow them the more as they stopped to check their progress and position. In the early afternoon, when Lyr thought his lungs would burst and his thighs snap, Rion brought the column to a halt. They had come across a gruesome scene. A pair of warriors approached Lyr. "The chieftain calls for you at the fore," they told him. "I come," Lyr replied, panting. He felt shame as he endured what he felt were their pitying looks. The warriors guided him to a sight of a cart that had been stripped. The planks of it lay in a heap. Its axle and wheels were missing, as well as the connecting arm that extended from the base of the cart to the animals that would draw it. It was a small cart, barely 5 feet wide by 7 feet long. Around it, Rion and his warriors formed a loose circle. All of these details Lyr absorbed as he approached. "They've killed the oxen, then?" Lyr asked. "The tracks still lead ahead. Deirdre and her scouts have not returned," Rion replied. Then he asked Lyr, "What can you discover of our foe from this?" Lyr examined the ground and the cart. He said, "I do not have the skill to tell you how many of them or how long ago the Picts were here." He knelt and looked at the wreckage. Many of the nails that had held the cart together were missing, as well as the metal bands that supported its bed. Burned into the wood of the planks was a symbol that Lyr had been taught by his uncle. "This is the mark of an Aquilonian legion," Lyr told Rion. He continued, "They must have ambushed a legion and then looted its weapons, armor, and engines of war. Fearing they would slow, they have taken the engine apart and stripped the cart of anything of worth. They most likely forced our kinsmen to carry the loot." Rion asked, "How could they learn how to fire the contraption?" "They may have tortured the information out of a legionnaire they captured, or kept one alive to be their engineer," Lyr commented. The young chieftain growled, "That's lovely. Armored Picts. Armored Picts with burning oil?" Likely, Lyr agreed, but I should think the steel weapons and armor went only to their equivalents of nobles and companions. I doubt they have enough armor and steel to swarm us, or they would have used it back at the battle in the Dun. And as we saw during the battle, they seemed to either loathe or fail to comprehend the concept of a shield wall. Thank Crom for that, said a warrior next to Rion. This means we have to pick up the pace, Rion growled. Lyr winced. Can you keep the pace, Derwood? Rion asked. It was a taunt, and Lyr knew it. He looked back to his chieftain and replied, If not, I will catch up. Rion was about to answer when Deirdre and her scouts appeared. They carried oxen horns with them, which they had shorn from a skull. She presented the valuable horns to her chieftain, and then informed them all of what she had discovered. They slaughtered their oxen about 200 yards ahead, as well as one of our kin. Our kin had a thigh wound, and they felt he was slowing them. It was not quick. Deirdre spat. Quickly, then. We run through the rest of this day and part of the night. We must press our advantage while we still have it, Rion commanded. Lyr despised that the command was the correct one. He did end up trailing behind them. 3 hours after the find of the wrecked cart, Lyr began to occasionally lose sight of the hunters. One of the warriors, Jurg, guided him along, as Lyr had not the skill to read the trail, much less when he was exhausted. They arrived at the new encampment near the middle of the night. Lyr stumbled, and Jurg caught him. It was yet another sign of weakness that Lyr kept in a tally of faults that he kept against himself. He found that at rest he had the need to vomit and heave. He could not understand how anyone could become so accustomed to the effort the hunters were giving. None of them seemed affected. Lyr limped away from the men and women of the troop. He blamed himself that the women were more manly than himself and found a place to lay. He was not there long before Deirdre approached. She coughed to attract his attention. Yes, my chieftainess? Lyr asked. Deirdre knelt and said, Please call me by my name. How can I aid you, Deirdre? Lyr asked. I came to see if you will be well enough to run tomorrow. Rion believes we should only take a few hours before we sprint past the Picts, Deirdre said. Sprint past? Lyr thought. He asked aloud, You've sighted them? Their camp was roughly a mile ahead of where we are now. The Brehan's vision was correct. They travel only at night. They may make as many as 10 miles tomorrow if they are lucky. The ground gets extremely rough as we go ahead. So I ask you again, will you be able to follow? Of course, though I may lag behind, Lyr spit. She patted his leg and he winced. You're no good to anyone dead, Lyr, son of Ife, kinsman of my tribe, she said. Lyr nodded. It was the first time any of the Dun had accepted him as a tribe member. The boy turned his face from Deirdre, for he once again did not trust his self-control. I will run, he promised. To his great surprise, Deirdre hugged him in a sisterly embrace. Then she arose and left him to his own inner battle. Deirdre had 3 brothers and 2 sisters. She knew the inner battles her brothers had survived to measure up to the high Cimmerian ideals. Now she recognized the same war within the neglected boy before her, and she wished she had not been one who had added to the weight he carried. Yet she had her own husband now to care for and to please. She could not remain over long. She returned to the bed of her chieftain. When he awoke the next day, Jurg was beside him. The others were gone. Why did you let me slumber? Lyr asked. I had my orders, boy. You do not command me. You only advise, the warrior commented. Besides, you needed the rest. Lyr's thighs hurt as much as they had the day before, but now a dull ache pervaded him rather than a burning pain. Lyr knew that the greater pain would return later in the day. He gathered his things and proceeded ahead. It was when he checked his possessions that he realized he had not performed the perfective measure of the incense smoke. Fear gripped him that he had allowed his tiredness to let him commit a fatal error. He did not tell Jurg about his failure, but instead shouldered his pack and tightened his belt. Jurg led them along at a pace that clearly he thought Lyr could keep. It was not quite a run and not quite a jog. Lyr wanted to urge them to go faster, but he had to admit the wisdom of the warrior's choice. Jurg knew more of the march life than Lyr. he must defer to the warrior's judgment. It was the Cimmerian way to acquiesce to those who had more skill and let them command at a task they excelled in. Jurg allowed him a quarter-hour rest around noon, and then another in the late afternoon. By the evening of that day they had run for a distance of 20 miles over the rough and unforgiving ground while packing heavy loads. It was a feat that few could be able to claim, but Lyr had no idea that what he had done was far above the ability of most other men. When they arrived at the new camp that Rion had set, they discovered that they could see the peak of the mountain into which Caerdar had been cut ages ago. The city had been abandoned long ago when a plague had run through its defensive rings. It was old. None could now say how old, yet it was also clearly a Cimmerian settlement. Statues, now eroded with wind and snow, still showed the features of their tribe and bore engravings of their script. Rion had set his warriors to digging concealed pits and deadfalls of logs. The plan seemed to Lyr to try to pinch the picks at the beginning and end of the trail with the logs and tempt them into the pits at the sides. The warriors worked as men possessed to accomplish the tasks before they would engage the picks. Jurg helped Lyr to sit by a tree. Rion approached and waved at Lyr to prevent him from rising. "Do you think it is wise to smoke us before the battle?" Rion asked. Some of Lyr's guilt evaporated with his response. "Individually, yes, but the area, no. The sorcerer might notice that he cannot see into the area if I sane it. But I also worry that his animals might scent the smoke upon our warriors. After they pass through the fumes, they should wash to clear their bodies of the scent." Lyr looked about the battleground that was being prepared. He said to Rion, "I will set up the preventative charm there, well ahead of the trail and sheltered from the wind." "A good plan," Rion commented. He was silent a moment, and then said, "The Derwood chose well. When the battle begins, I want you to be near Deirdre, there, on that small rise." Lyr looked to where Rion was pointing. There he noticed the women placing out arrows and javelins for throwing. The rise had the ruin of a low-standing wall on its lip. A group of warriors laying there would escape detection from the men on the ground that approached. It was a good spot for a marksman, but Lyr had no missile weapon. He feared he was being regulated to a place of lesser glory in the coming battle. Cimmerians lived and died by their deeds, might be sung before fires to expectant tribesmen. Rion was placing Lyr where there would be little chance for glory. "It is not a slight, Lyr," Rion explained, for he had correctly read the momentary look of despair on Lyr's face. The chieftain continued, "If you perish, who will bind the wounds of the captives or the warriors? If you die, others might die with you. Yes, your lack of skill in battle is a factor in my decision, but can you argue against my logic?" "No," Lyr admitted, though it hurt to confess. Rion clapped him on the shoulder. "You've saved my wife's life once already, man. Take the honor of being in a position to defend her again. For my ease of mind, if nothing else." Lyr recognized that Rion was trying to manipulate him by appealing not only to his reason but his sense of duty. He would have preferred Rion to remain a thuggish brute rather than an astute war leader, but he could not fault the decision. "I will guard her and her compatriots, my chieftain," Lyr replied. Lyr left to set up his incense. As he ground the herbs, he pretended that it was Chieftain Crooked Nose's face crumbling under his pestle, as Rion's nose had caved under his flagon. That the man had been able to keep the pace despite the pain of his nose and how it must have complicated breathing was a feat of high endurance. Lyr wondered if Rion was part bull. From the noises that escaped Deirdre during the night, he might be. Self-loathing at his own pettiness and jealousy now drove Lyr onward. He prepared each of the warriors, and then walked stiffly back to the rise that Rion had pointed out. Jurg aided Lyr in the climb, as his limbs were still sore and aching. Finally in position, the young man set down his shield and laid his mace at the ready. Deirdre and her women had finished their preparations. Arrows lay naked beside their positions to speed putting them to the string. Bows were strung, and hand weapons free of scabbards. The women also lay on their bellies in wait. Deirdre was beside Lyr, and he longed to speak with her, but feared to do so with the other women near. She was the chieftainess now. Such a confession of his inner world would not only make him appear weak, but might be interpreted as an unseemly advance. So he waited. He felt sleep tugging at him. He resisted, but Deirdre whispered in his ear, "Sleep. I will wake you. After the battle is over, you may be busy for many hours." Lyr complied with his chieftainess's wish.